Cammack. Is that right? Can you hear me, Perry?
I can.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. A huge welcome to our global viewers from the Middle East Policy Council located in Washington, D.C. My name is Basma Al-Hussein, and I am the Executive Director of this fabulous organization. This conversation today continues our monthly Journal Contributor Dialogue series, which is designed to inform U.S. policymakers with the most current insight and analysis on urgent foreign policy matters in the Middle East. We look forward to a deeply thought-provoking discussion today with Perry Cammack regarding his essay, The Old Diplomatic Playbook Has Failed Israel-Palestine, that was recently published in the American Prospect. Mr. Cammack has also been published in our world-renowned journal, Middle East Policy, which you can access online through our website, www.mepc.org, and has participated in our esteemed Capitol Hill Conference series. Mr. Cammack currently serves as the Program Director for Peace Building at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. He previously served on the policy planning staff in the Office of Secretary of State John Kerry and as a staff member for both Senators Joe Biden and John Kerry. Welcome, Mr. Cammack. We are so grateful to have you.
Thank you, Basma. I'm thrilled to be here.
To begin, can you please give our viewers who have not yet had the opportunity to read your essay a brief summary of the thesis, main points, and conclusion, and any main developments that our viewers should be aware of since your article was published at the end of May?
So I wrote the article, obviously, at the tail end of the fourth Gaza war between Hamas and Israel. And it basically out of a sentiment that the kind of prevailing US policy towards Israel and Palestine, like many aspects of US foreign policy, had reached a dead end. And I'll be the very first to admit that I don't necessarily have the answers of how to get out of that dead end. But I think the point was to, in a very modest way, kind of spark an honest discussion that challenges some of the conventional wisdoms regarding Israel, Palestine, and particularly US policy towards Israel-Palestine. My basic argument, and I'll be the first, I was a little cheeky with it, I was having a little fun, is that the US has a kind of unwritten standard playbook, particularly for Gaza wars, but also for managing the Israel-Palestine conflict more broadly. I don't need to go into the detail of what that playbook looks like, but I think the point I was trying to make is that it actually allows US policymakers, in a sense, to preserve a kind of myth that if only the two sides could just get back into negotiations, peace is possible. And I think that myth, unfortunately, allows policymakers in the United States, as well as in Europe, also to convince themselves that the military occupation, now in its 54th year, I believe, of the West Bank, and the military blockade, now in, I believe, its 14th year of Gaza, are temporary phenomena. And so thereby it allows US officials and policymakers essentially to absolve themselves of their own complicity in sustaining what I called this in the article, the systematic Israeli repression of Palestinians. And if one more sentence I'll just add, which may kind of trigger more questions, is interestingly, President Biden kind of took a break with that playbook. I believe it back in May, and I believe it's when he actually announced the ceasefire. He said, "I believe that Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live safely and securely, and to enjoy in equal measures, freedom, prosperity, and democracy." And I think actually just in that one sentence, you can see the DNA of what could be a new and more balanced approach to Israel, to Palestine, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Do you think that dwindling public support for Israel in the US could have an impact on US foreign policy? And do you think that might be part of the reason that we heard this from the Biden administration? If so, how do you think it could shape the Biden administration's negotiations going forward?
So I worked on kind of at the intersection of politics, kind of public opinion, and policy on Capitol Hill for 10 years, and I've thought a lot about this question. And the kind of model I have in my head is that the kind of exercise of U.S. foreign policy is something like a chaotic storm somewhere in the North Atlantic. And when you're in the middle of that storm, kind of wind is blowing from every direction, waves are blowing from every direction. You're just trying to get the ship that you're steering kind of through. And you're not necessarily conscious in real time of these kind of deeper prevailing winds or currents that are shaping foreign policy. So I actually think that kind of discussions of U.S. interests on one hand and of kind of public opinion, they're actually two sides of the flip of the same coin. But these kind of narrative shifts that I think we saw to some extent in May, we only see them indirectly in the exercise of foreign policy day to day, week to week, even month to month. So I'm not necessarily expecting dramatic changes from this particular administration with respect to Israel and Palestine, but I think we do see the seeds of the debate that I mentioned at the very beginning that I think we need to have, and where that takes us, I think will only be determined in a kind of longer time horizon.
That is such an excellent answer, and it's a perfect segue into my next question. Do you think that U.S. foreign policy interests are the driving force behind the U.S. being the quote unquote ultimate broker in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, or do you think it is domestic interests in politics?
Well, as I said, ultimately, I think these are kind of flip sides of the same coin. Foreign policy practitioners, whether it's diplomats or congressional staffers or kind of think tankers, I think have developed certain kind of norms and discourses. But ultimately, it's the U.S. voters that are going to decide what core U.S. foreign policy interests are. I think the public understanding, and obviously it's dynamic and complex and contentious, but those are shifts that kind of really evolve over years and even decades. And I think there are clearly strong political constituencies, multiple constituencies that strongly support U.S. support for Israel. I think, and that's just a deeply embedded character of U.S. political life. What I do think is new, though, is that there are voices emerging that are saying, well, Palestinian lives matter too, and Palestinian perspectives matter too. And so I think there is a kind of almost dialectic going on of as individuals at the voting level, but even policymakers kind of try to reconcile these two notions, which in some ways are contrary, but I think as President Biden alluded to, there could be a way to kind of synthesize this potentially in a rights-based approach, which makes co-equal Palestinian and Israeli security concerns, aspirations, freedoms, and human rights.
And do you think that in the US, the increasing prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement has played into some of the momentum arguing for Palestinian basic human rights?
There's no question in my mind, Basma, that is the case. I think more and more Americans are kind of coming to terms with our own history, with the United States' own legacy of chattel slavery, of racism. I think there's also growing awareness that some of those pathologies are also deeply embedded in U.S. foreign policy. They're deeply embedded in U.S. foreign policy to the Middle East, and they're even embedded in U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine. And I think it's hard to have a kind of racial justice framework for the United States while then saying that whether we're talking about Israel, Palestine, or Afghanistan, or Egypt, or Syria, where we kind of privilege one group of citizens' rights over another.
Thank you for that insight. And do you think you could speak a little bit more specifically to how that's playing out on the Hill? As a former congressional staffer myself, I thought it was very interesting to see some shifts in the statements from the Congressional Black Caucus, who historically had always been very strong supporters of Israel in light of the history of Jewish people being enslaved in Egypt and so on and so forth. But that seems to also be shifting a bit. Could you speak to that?
Well, certainly. I mean, I worked on the Hill in the kind of 2000s, from 2003 to roughly 2013, and there's no doubt in my mind that the discourse on Israel and Palestine has shifted dramatically. It's opened dramatically. I think that's a positive thing. As many of your viewers will know, there is a vigorous debate on these issues inside Israel. But oftentimes the debate in Washington is more stilted, that there are perceived to be kind of taboo subjects or third rails. And I think kind of open discussion of these issues is without presupposing which direction they go or where they go. I think certainly having more people of color as representatives, I think, is good for us as a country. It's good for our diversity, but it's also good for our foreign policy, and to kind of, as I said, to challenge or at least question or at least talk about some of these perceived wisdoms or that you know that I think are very present in terms of discussions of Israel-Palestine.
Amen to that. I think diversity is so important across the board as well. And I agree with you 100%. I've noticed a lot of those same shifts. So now, kind of leaving from the US borders and how we think about it within the US, how does the current Israeli government under Prime Minister Naftali Bennett differ from the government under Benjamin Netanyahu? And if there are differences, how do you think that might affect the US?
So certainly, Prime Minister Netanyahu was, I mean, I don't think it's unfair to say that he was an uncommonly cynical politician, and the last years of his rule were essentially a period of permanent crisis. And so certainly many Israeli friends of mine just feel that there's a political space in Israel that exists now. I mean, as Trump was a kind of larger than life figure in the United States and really dominated U.S. political discourse, I think something similar was true in Israel. And so there's now a very, frankly, schizophrenic government in Israel, which ranges from the far right to the progressive left, and even includes an Islamist party and essentially everything in between. So I think in that sense, there are discussions, there are openings that haven't been possible in Israel for a decade. At least, you know, this is just based on what Israeli friends and Palestinian friends are telling me. But I think it's also important to note that if you're a Palestinian in Hebron, you don't necessarily see any difference. I mean, the occupation has now been going for 54 years. The rhetoric coming from Jerusalem has maybe eased a little bit, but the policies haven't fundamentally changed. And in fact, Prime Minister Bennett has even gone further than his predecessor did in saying basically that there will never be a two-state solution, which I think raises the important question: if we are stuck in a one-state reality, is that a one-state reality in which all citizens have equal rights, economic rights, social rights, political rights, or is it a situation in which one situation is systematically privileged over another? And I think we know what that looks like in history. We know what that kind of arrangement looks like in American history. We know what it looks like in South Africa. And I think that's the big question, I think, is whether the United States is going to acquiesce in allowing a one-state reality in which not all the inhabitants of the geographic space are allowed to enjoy the same rights and privileges.
Right. And I think that understandably, there are some concerns on the Israeli side that if that were to happen, that would certainly undermine the Zionist vision of having a Jewish state. It would be a multi-racial, multi-religious state. So we'll see. A couple of the things that you pointed out in your article that I thought were really interesting was that number one, the US continues to give $4 billion in US military aid to Israel every year with no strings attached. And then number two, you highlighted the importance or the ability of the United States to potentially end the blockade against Gaza. Do you think using that leverage of the military aid is a way that the blockade against Gaza could be ended? And what do you think is happening now that's contributing to this continuing blockade?
So, I mean, on one hand, I think it has to be said first that Israel, like any state, has a right to defend itself. And the situation where thousands and tens of thousands of rockets are assembled at the border is intolerable. But I think after 14 years, I think we can also say that it's clear that if the stated purpose of the blockade was to either weaken Hamas politically, that is, undermine their ability to control Gaza, or if the stated objective is to stop the flow of these rockets, it's failed on both accounts. And meanwhile, it's the 1.5 or 2 million citizens of Gaza who've been forced to pay the price in the form of punishing a series of punishing wars. So I am not in this article advocating cutting U.S. assistance to Israel, although there are voices who are making that demand, including now within the U.S. Congress. What I am saying is that Israel is in a position where it dominates Palestine economically, diplomatically, militarily, and enjoys essentially the unconditional support of the region's most important power, which is the United States. And that in this kind of zero-sum game in which every is concession by one side is seen by a loss by the other, it makes kind of logical sense that there would be no Israeli concessions, meaning really fundamental concessions towards Palestinian statehood. Because there's no need to, because Israel, in a sense, is in a position where the occupation is not exacting really any meaningful price. And so what I am saying is that if the United States really does, in fact, believe that the human rights and the well-being of both peoples are equal, that it needs to put some of these things in play, and it has leverage that it could exert if it were inclined to do so, and that should be contemplated if the United States really is committed towards a peaceful solution.
That is an excellent point. And that actually brings me to my next question, which, let's say that never happened, and the US didn't leverage or didn't utilize its tools to help solve this conflict. Do you think it's possible that a solution could ever be brokered without the mediation of Western powers, or is that just completely out of the question?
Well, never say never, but I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely. I kind of alluded to this. I'm not sure why Israel has necessarily an incentive. It can have its cake and eat it too. I actually think if the United States were to exert some more leverage here, and it can be small steps, it can be, it can start just by reopening the consulate and not necessarily tying that decision to the budget deliberations, for example, that are ongoing in Israel, but to say we are doing this because historically we've had a diplomatic presence to engage with Palestinians in Jerusalem. We've had it for decades, and we're going back to having that. Small steps like this, I think, actually could and maybe would activate kind of new discussions within Israel. There are, I think, political forces inside Israel that would welcome these kinds of moves, and so that would actually, rather than jeopardize the kind of tenuous, admittedly, political situation that exists in Israel, it actually could galvanize kind of discussions in new ways.
Excellent. I'm wondering, has the recent shift in alliances in the Middle East, so we of course have seen the historical signing of the Abraham Accords, have any effect on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And if so, how?
Well, philosophically, I believe in diplomacy. So I think kind of opening diplomatic vectors in any direction is generally a good thing. Many Palestinians I know feel that they have been further marginalized by the Abraham Accords, and that indeed it was in some ways designed to marginalize them. I think in some ways their leadership in Ramallah has not necessarily been productive in terms of ending this sense of diplomatic and political marginalization. At the same time, my sense is that the Palestinian cause runs deep within Arab societies, not just in Israel, Palestine, and the near neighbors like Jordan and Egypt, but it resonates in the Gulf as well. And I think it will be interesting over time. I think a deepening of diplomatic relations is generally a positive thing anywhere it happens. But I think it will be interesting to see if these relationships in some ways put new constraints on Israel with respect to the wars in Gaza or the occupation in the West Bank. I think the jury's out, and time will tell.
You mentioned some of the frustration among the Palestinian people towards the quote unquote incompetence of the Palestinian Authority. I'm wondering if you can speak a little to that, and if the US is capable of empowering the Palestinian Authority as an organization, how we could do so.
Well, first I should acknowledge that because of the pandemic, I've not been able to travel to Palestine, in almost 2 years, and I certainly would not speak on behalf of Palestinians. But I do hear from Palestinian friends and contacts and colleagues. I do hear great frustration with their own leadership. That in many ways it's become a tool of the occupation. And I think in terms of the arrests of civil society activists, not by the Israelis, although that has happened too, but by the Palestinians, and in one case, even the murder of a prominent Palestinian activist by Palestinian security forces, I think highlights this, that not only is the PA and the PLO, I think generally, or at least among many of my contacts, not seen as advancing the kind of cause of Palestinian nationalism. It's actively seen in some cases as undermining it. And so I think, again, this rights-based approach that the Biden administration alluded to, it doesn't just apply between, or could be thought of as not just applying between Israelis and Palestinians, but within Israeli society and within Palestinian society as well.
My next question is about this kind of shift we're seeing regionally. So, for example, in Afghanistan, there's this question on the table: will the US be forced to recognize the Taliban? As you know, the Trump administration held the Doha Accords and negotiated with them directly. So there seems to be kind of a movement towards accepting the realities on the ground of who's in charge versus, I think, past culture in the US, which was we don't talk to terrorists. In light of that opening, do you think if the US were to reconvene the players in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that there would be an opening to bring Hamas to the table, or that indeed would be a requirement to find some kind of effective solution?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, and I think I'm not trying to weasel out of it by saying a lot would depend on the context at the time. But what I think can be said is it's clear that Hamas is part of the Palestine. It's a political reality. The U.S. didn't talk to Fatah for decades, until the 1980s, I believe. The U.S. did not engage with Nelson Mandela or the African National Congress for decades. At some point, if there is to be peace in this part of the world, Hamas will have to be brought in, will have to be part of the process. I think there's just no way around that. Now, how that looks operationally, tactically, sequentially, I think is, really very much depends on the context and the circumstances. But kind of putting Hamas off until the very end and presupposing that peace can be made between Ramallah and Jerusalem without any kind of involvement of Gaza itself, I think is a fantasy.
Thank you. And then lastly, I'm wondering, especially in the context of the administration's emphasis on decreasing Iranian proliferation of nuclear weapons, where do you think the Israeli-Palestine conflict falls in the priority list of Middle East agenda items for the Biden administration?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, first, I think it has to be said that foreign policy in general is clearly taking a backseat to domestic agenda items. And I think that's quite understandable given the pandemic, the economic duress that the country's been under, the January 6th insurrection, et cetera, et cetera. So that's understandable. And even within the foreign policy sphere, it seems that the Middle East is taking a backseat, and I would say in many ways justifiably so, to kind of China, transatlantic relations, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. I think here there are, or at least it's my instinct, that there are, if you talk to policymakers in the region, most of them would identify Iran as many of them would identify Iran as the number one regional challenge. But I think if you talk to their publics, you might get a somewhat different answer. As I mentioned, at least it's my sentiment that the kind of solidarity to the Palestinian cause runs pretty deep many places. Whether that or not how that gets transmitted into the foreign policy sphere is an interesting and complicated question. And again, I think this is a space to watch in terms of the longer term impact of the Abraham Accords, and one I think we really don't know yet. Clearly, Iran was one of the main drivers. The threat of Iran, shared by Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, others, I think, was one of the motivating factors of the Abraham Accords. But kind of how Palestine plays into that narratively over time, I think, remains to be seen.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Cammack. We will be sure to watch these developments evolve and keep in touch with you. I'd like to remind our viewers that due to COVID, we have moved the majority of our programming online. And an advantage of this is that our speakers and audience can now join us from all over the world. With such an incredibly dynamic Middle East, you can rely on MEPC for trustworthy information and in-depth analysis and fabulous guest speakers just like Mr. Cammack today. Please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and like and share this video. And please be sure to follow us on Twitter for timely news updates. Thank you again for joining us, Mr. Cammack. Have a